The first anomaly appeared on radar screens across 3 NATO air bases simultaneously at 3:47 hours Greenwich Mean Time. Controllers stared at their displays, watching something impossible unfold in the pre-dawn darkness above the North Sea. An aircraft signature had materialized from nothing, moving at speeds that defied conventional physics, executing maneuvers that should have liquefied any human pilot under gravitational forces exceeding 12 gs. The signature pulsed like a ghost on their screens, there one moment, gone the next, reappearing miles away in patterns that made seasoned radar operators question their own sanity. Wing Commander Marcus Blackwood pressed his palm against the cold glass of the control tower at RAF Luchars, his breath fogging the window as he watched 6 Eurofighter Typhoons thunder into the gray Scottish sky. Their afterburners painted orange streaks against the clouds, each aircraft worth £75 million and piloted by some of Europe's finest aviators. They were hunting something that intelligence reports suggested might be a prototype Russian stealth fighter, testing NATO response times in international airspace. What they didn't know was that they were about to encounter something that would redefine everything they understood about aerial combat. The mysterious aircraft had first been detected over Norwegian waters, moving south at impossible speeds. Satellite imagery captured only fleeting glimpses, a shadow against clouds, a distortion in the atmosphere that seemed to bend light itself. NATO command designated it Phantom Wing, a code name that would soon carry weight far beyond its mysterious origins. 3 squadrons had already attempted intercept missions. All had returned with the same report: target lost, pilots reporting equipment malfunctions and disorientation. But this morning was different. This morning, Squadron Leader Valentina Viper Kozlova sat in the cockpit of Typhoon Delta 7, her hands steady on the controls despite the ridicule she'd endured from her squadron mates. They called her the reject behind her back, the Ukrainian pilot who transferred from a disbanded air force, the woman who'd somehow earned her wings despite being too small for real combat. They saw her slight frame and assumed weakness. They heard her accented English and assumed incompetence. What they didn't see was the steel in her gray eyes, forged in the crucible of a war most of them had only read about. As the 6 Typhoons formed up in combat spread formation, climbing through 15,000 feet toward their patrol sector, none of them could imagine that within the next hour, everything they believed about aerial supremacy would be shattered by a pilot whose greatest strength had always been underestimation. Valentina adjusted her oxygen mask and checked her weapons systems. Today felt different. Today, she would show them what the sky really meant to someone who had learned to fly not for glory, but for survival. The hunt for Phantom Wing was about to become something far more extraordinary than anyone could have predicted. And at the center of it all was a pilot whose legend was just beginning to take flight. Radar contact Alpha vectored the formation northeast, their voices crackling through radio static as they climbed toward Angels 25. The North Sea stretched endlessly below them, its gray waters reflecting the overcast sky like burnished steel. Valentina flew in the number 4 position, deliberately placed there by Flight Leader Squadron Leader Timothy Ashworth, a career RAF officer who believed women belonged in transport aircraft, not fighters. He'd made his opinions clear during the briefing, suggesting she maintain defensive posture and try not to get in the way. The irony wasn't lost on her. In Ukraine, she'd flown 57 combat missions in outdated MiG-29s, facing Russian Su-35s with equipment that belonged in museums. She'd earned her call sign Viper not for aggression, but for her ability to strike from unexpected angles, turning apparent disadvantage into devastating advantage. Her squadron had been decimated, her homeland occupied, but she'd never been shot down, never even been hit. Delta formation, this is control. Phantom Wing contact bearing 090, range 120 nautical miles, altitude unknown. Bogey appears to be descending toward your patrol sector. The controller's voice carried tension that even radio static couldn't mask. Exercise extreme caution. Previous intercept attempts report significant electronic interference and disorientation. Ashworth's response crackled through their helmets. Roger, control. Delta formation, weapons tight, maintain combat spread. Viper, stay on my 6 and follow my lead. Valentina bit back her response. Follow his lead. As if she were a rookie on her first training flight. She'd been following leads her entire career, following orders that sent her friends to die, following politicians who abandoned her country, following a path that brought her here, to this moment, carrying the weight of everyone who'd underestimated her potential. Through her helmet visor, she watched the other Typhoons adjust formation. Each pilot was a product of years of expensive training, flying aircraft equipped with the most advanced avionics systems money could buy. But none of them had learned to fly with bullets actually aimed at them. None of them had felt the percussion of surface-to-air missiles exploding close enough to rattle their teeth. They flew with the confidence of men who'd never truly been hunted. The radar signature appeared on her display like a green phantom, exactly as briefed. Bearing 087, range 95 nautical miles, moving at speeds that made her blink twice to confirm the readings. Mach 2.8 and climbing. No known aircraft should be capable of those velocities at that altitude. The signature pulsed erratically, sometimes solid, sometimes translucent, as if the aircraft itself was phasing in and out of reality. Contact confirmed, Ashworth announced. Phantom wing bearing 085, range 80 nautical miles. Delta 2 through 6, maintain formation integrity. We approach from the southwest, standard intercept profile. Standard intercept profile. Valentina almost smiled. There was nothing standard about an aircraft that could appear and disappear from radar, that could pull maneuvers exceeding human physiological limits. But these men approached every problem the same way, with textbook procedures and overwhelming firepower. She had learned to approach problems differently. The mysterious aircraft continued its descent, now passing through 30,000 feet at speeds that should have torn any conventional fighter apart. Valentina studied the radar return, noting patterns the others had missed. The signature wasn't random, it pulsed in sequences, almost like a heartbeat, like something alive. Through her earpiece, she heard control updating their vector. Delta formation, adjust heading to 080. Target appears to be leveling at 25,000 feet, maintaining course toward your position. Whatever phantom wing was, it wasn't running. It was coming to meet them. The gray expanse of the North Sea passed beneath them like a living thing, its surface stirred by winds that carried the scent of storms brewing beyond the horizon. At 25,000 feet, the sky held that peculiar quality of early morning light, where darkness hadn't quite surrendered to dawn. Valentina had always loved this hour, when the world balanced on the edge between night and day. It reminded her of the moments before combat, when anything was possible. Her Typhoon's engines hummed with restrained power, twin EJ-200 turbofans generating 40,000 pounds of thrust, enough to push the aircraft past Mach 2 in level flight. The cockpit around her was a marvel of engineering, multifunction displays showing everything from weapon status to threat assessment, helmet-mounted sight tracking her eye movements, to slave sensors and weapons to her line of sight. She was strapped into $900 million worth of technology, flying alongside 5 of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built. And yet, as Phantom Wing's radar signature grew stronger on her display, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to encounter something that rendered all their technological advantages meaningless. Delta formation, this is control. Phantom Wing now bearing 078, range 40 nautical miles, altitude 25,000 feet. Target appears to be maintaining steady course and speed. You should have visual contact in approximately 6 minutes. Ashworth's voice came through their radios with practiced authority. Roger, control. Delta formation, Arm weapons systems but maintain weapons tight. We're going to take a close look at our mysterious friend. Valentina flipped the master arm switch, feeling the familiar click as her aircraft's weapon systems came online. 4 AMRAAM air-to-air missiles hung from her wing pylons, each capable of engaging targets beyond visual range with devastating accuracy. Her 27 Mauser cannon was loaded with 150 rounds of high-explosive ammunition. On paper, she possessed enough firepower to destroy a squadron of enemy fighters. But as the radar return ahead of them grew stronger and stranger, she began to wonder if conventional weapons would prove effective against whatever they were about to face. The signature wasn't behaving like any aircraft she'd ever encountered. It seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, growing bright on radar one moment, fading to almost nothing the next. The electronic warfare officers back at control had reported intermittent jamming, but the patterns were unlike anything in their threat databases. Delta 2, do you have visual? Ashworth called to his wingman, squadron leader James Mitchell, flying the number 2 position. Negative visual lead. Radar contact bearing 075, range 30 nautical miles. Whatever this thing is, it's flying straight toward us. Valentina adjusted her radar settings, switching from long-range search to track-while-scan mode. The mysterious aircraft appeared on her scope as a solid contact now, definitely maintaining course toward their formation. But something about the return bothered her. The radar cross-section was too small for the speeds being reported. Either their equipment was malfunctioning, or they were tracking something that defied conventional understanding of stealth technology. Through her canopy, she could see the other Typhoons spread across the sky like predatory birds, their gray camouflage making them nearly invisible against the cloud deck below. Each pilot was undoubtedly running through mental checklists, preparing for visual identification procedures, ready to follow established protocols for intercepting unknown aircraft in international airspace. But Valentina's mind was working differently. Years of combat experience had taught her to look for patterns others missed, to find opportunity in apparent disadvantage. As she studied the radar return, she began to notice something the others had overlooked. The timing of Phantom Wing's radar pulses wasn't random. There was a sequence, a rhythm that reminded her of something from her past. The Ukrainian pilot who taught her to fly had been shot down over Crimea 3 years ago. Before he died, he'd shared a story about experimental aircraft developed in Soviet research facilities, projects so classified that even their existence remained theoretical. Aircraft that could manipulate electromagnetic signatures, that could appear to violate laws of physics through advanced materials and unconventional design. As the range closed to 20 nautical miles, Valentina began to suspect they weren't hunting an enemy aircraft at all. They were about to encounter something far more extraordinary and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The first visual contact came not from the formation leader, but from Valentina herself, whose eyes had been trained by necessity to spot threats others missed. Through the crystalline air at 25,000 feet, she caught a glint of reflected sunlight, there one moment, gone the next. Not the familiar silhouette of any known aircraft, but something that seemed to shimmer like heat distortion, bending light around its edges. Delta 7 has visual contact, she announced, her accented voice cutting through radio static. Bearing 072, range approximately 15 nautical miles, altitude appears level with our position. Negative Viper, Ashworth responded immediately. I have no visual contact at that bearing. Check your instruments. But Valentina's instruments were functioning perfectly. Her radar showed the contact clearly, and her eyes confirmed what technology couldn't fully explain. The aircraft ahead of them wasn't invisible, but it seemed to exist in a state of optical uncertainty, as if reality itself couldn't quite decide whether it was there or not. Delta 7, maintain position and follow my lead, Ashworth ordered, his voice carrying the irritation of a man accustomed to unquestioned authority. Delta 2, do you confirm visual contact? Negative visual, Mitchell replied. Radar contact is intermittent, range 12 nautical miles and closing. Valentina felt familiar frustration building in her chest. How many times had she been dismissed, her observations questioned, her experience discounted? In Ukraine, she'd learned to trust her instincts when instruments failed and protocols proved inadequate. She'd survived because she'd learned to see what others couldn't, to act when hesitation meant death. The mysterious aircraft continued its approach, and now she could make out more details that made her pulse quicken. Its configuration was unlike anything in any recognition manual: wings that seemed to flow seamlessly into the fuselage, surfaces that reflected light in ways that hurt to look at directly. It moved with impossible smoothness, as if friction and turbulence were merely suggestions rather than laws of physics. Delta formation, this is control, the radio crackled. Phantom Wing is now at range 10 nautical miles, maintaining course directly toward your position. Exercise extreme caution. Electronic warfare section reports significant jamming attempting to lock onto your formation. Jamming, but Valentina's instruments showed no signs of electronic interference. Her radar tracking remained solid, her navigation systems functioned normally. Either the jamming was specifically targeted at the other aircraft, or something else entirely was happening. She watched Ashworth's Typhoon begin to deviate from course, its movements becoming erratic as the pilot struggled with what she assumed were instrument failures. The other aircraft in the formation showed similar signs of distress: uncoordinated turns, altitude variations that suggested pilots fighting against their own flight controls. But Delta 7 flew straight and true, Valentina's hands steady on the controls, her aircraft responding normally to every input. Whatever was affecting the others had no impact on her systems. And as the range closed to 8 nautical miles, she began to understand why. The aircraft approaching them wasn't generating electronic jamming in any conventional sense. It was projecting something far more sophisticated, a field that interfered with pilot perception, creating disorientation and confusion. But Valentina had spent years flying damaged aircraft with malfunctioning instruments, navigating by instinct when technology failed. Her mind had been trained to filter out distraction, to focus on essential inputs even when surrounded by chaos. As the mysterious aircraft drew closer, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of following Ashworth's increasingly erratic lead, she broke formation, diving beneath the other Typhoons to position herself for a clear visual identification pass. Delta 7 returned to formation immediately. Ashworth's voice carried panic now, his usual authority replaced by fear of the unknown. But Valentina was already committed to her intercept course, her aircraft climbing back toward the mysterious contact that had appeared from nowhere and defied every conventional explanation. She was about to come face to face with something that would reshape her understanding of what was possible in the sky she'd made her home. At 5 nautical miles, Phantom Wing filled her canopy with impossible geometry and otherworldly beauty. The aircraft, if it could still be called that, seemed to be constructed from materials that shifted and flowed like liquid mercury while maintaining perfect structural integrity. Its wingspan appeared to vary depending on viewing angle, sometimes broad and delta-shaped, other times narrow and swept like a blade. The fuselage was seamless, without visible cockpit or engine intakes, yet it clearly contained propulsion systems capable of performance beyond anything in human inventory. But what stopped Valentina's breath wasn't the technology, it was the recognition. Etched into the aircraft's port wing, visible only when light struck it at precisely the right angle, was a symbol she'd seen before. Not in any intelligence briefing or threat assessment, but painted on the side of a hangar in western Ukraine, where experimental aircraft had been tested during the last desperate months of the war. The symbol of the Ghost Squadron, pilots who'd volunteered for missions so classified that their existence had been denied even after death. "Control, this is Delta 7, she transmitted, her voice steady despite the implications racing through her mind. "I have close visual contact with Phantom Wing. Recommend immediate stand-down of intercept mission. Negative, Delta 7. Maintain intercept course and prepare for identification procedures." But the mysterious aircraft was already responding to her presence, not with hostility, but with something that looked almost like recognition. It began to mirror her movements, matching her altitude and speed with precision that suggested not just advanced technology, but pilot skill beyond anything she'd encountered. When she banked left, it banked left. When she climbed, it climbed. Like a dance performed at 500 miles per hour, 25,000 feet above the North Sea. Through her helmet's integrated communication system, she heard Ashworth struggling to regain control of his formation. "Delta 2 through 6, reform on my position. We're experiencing significant electronic interference. Delta 7, return to formation immediately." But Valentina was beyond formation flying now. She was engaged in something far more profound, a conversation conducted in the language of aerial maneuver, pilot to pilot, across technological gaps that shouldn't have been possible to bridge. The other aircraft was showing her something, demonstrating capabilities that redefined her understanding of flight itself. As she watched, Phantom Wing executed a maneuver that made her gasp involuntarily. It seemed to fold in on itself, compressing its airframe into a configuration that should have been aerodynamically impossible, then expanding again into a completely different shape. Throughout the transformation, it maintained perfect formation with her Typhoon, as if the laws of physics were merely guidelines to be followed or ignored at will. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't a Russian prototype or experimental stealth fighter. This was something else entirely. Technology so advanced that it suggested origins beyond conventional military development. But the symbol on its wing, the way it responded to her presence, indicated human pilots were somehow involved in its operation. She thought of her squadron mates back in Ukraine, the ones who'd volunteered for missions they'd never returned from, the ones whose aircraft had simply vanished from radar, officially listed as equipment failures or pilot error. What if they hadn't died? What if they'd been recruited for something that transcended national boundaries, something that required the kind of pilot skills forged only in actual combat? The mysterious aircraft began to pull away, not retreating but leading, as if inviting her to follow. Every instinct developed through years of combat told her this was the most important moment of her career. Whatever Phantom Wing represented, whoever was piloting it, they'd chosen to reveal themselves to her for a reason. Behind her, she could hear Ashworth's increasingly frantic radio calls, demanding her return to formation. But ahead of her, the impossible aircraft was opening a door to possibilities she'd never imagined. The choice was hers: follow orders and return to a world that would never quite believe what had happened here, or pursue answers that might change everything. Valentina Viper Kozlova had always chosen the dangerous path. Today would be no different. The decision point lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but those seconds contained the weight of everything Valentina had learned about loyalty, duty, and the cost of following orders without question. Behind her, 5 Typhoons struggled with systems failures and pilot disorientation. Ahead, Phantom Wing maintained its leisurely pace, leading her toward coordinates that didn't appear on any chart. "Delta 7, this is Control. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Abort intercept mission and reform with Delta formation." She keyed her radio, choosing words that would haunt official reports for decades. "Control, this is Viper. I am proceeding with close escort of unknown aircraft. Phantom Wing appears to be leading me toward specific coordinates, maintaining visual contact and communication protocols." Communication protocols. If only they knew what kind of communication was actually taking place. The mysterious aircraft wasn't transmitting on any radio frequency her equipment could detect, but somehow she understood its intentions as clearly as if they were speaking face to face. It wanted her to follow, to see something that would explain not just its presence, but the disappearance of pilots who'd been presumed dead. Ashworth's voice exploded through her headset. "Delta 7, you are in direct violation of orders. Return to formation or face court-martial." Court-martial. The threat seemed absurd considering what was unfolding around them. How do you court-martial a pilot for following an aircraft that officially doesn't exist? How do you explain in military legal proceedings that one of your squadron members encountered technology that redefined the possible? "Roger that, Delta Lead," she replied, maintaining professional tone despite the magnitude of what was happening. "Continuing escort mission. Phantom Wing is maintaining course bearing 045, climbing to flight level 350. 35,000 feet. Above commercial air traffic, beyond most surface-to-air threats, in airspace where only the most advanced military aircraft could operate effectively." The mysterious aircraft was taking her into its natural environment, the realm where conventional fighters became awkward visitors rather than apex predators. As they climbed, Valentina noticed her Typhoon's performance improving rather than degrading. At this altitude, her engines should have been struggling with reduced air density, her control surfaces losing effectiveness in the thin atmosphere. Instead, her aircraft felt more responsive than ever, as if Phantom Wing was somehow enhancing her flight characteristics through proximity alone. The other Typhoons were falling behind now, their pilots unable to match the climb rate while dealing with what she was beginning to understand weren't system failures at all, but cognitive interference. Phantom Wing's technology didn't jam electronics. It overwhelmed human perception, creating sensory confusion that made normal flight operations nearly impossible. But her years of flying damaged aircraft with failing instruments had immunized her against such disorientation. "Control, this is Delta Lead," Ashworth transmitted, his voice strained with effort. "We are unable to maintain formation with Delta 7, experiencing significant equipment malfunctions and request immediate return to base." "Roger, Delta Lead, you are cleared to return to base. Delta 7, acknowledge immediate return order." Valentina looked ahead at Phantom Wing, now climbing through 40,000 feet with grace that made her Typhoon seem like a lumbering transport by comparison. The aircraft had settled into a configuration she'd never seen before, wings swept back into a near-triangular shape, fuselage elongated and streamlined, every line speaking of speeds that belonged more to spacecraft than atmospheric fighters. "Control, Delta 7, unable to comply with return order, am experiencing unique circumstances that require continued investigation." Unique circumstances. Military euphemism for a situation so far outside normal parameters that conventional language proved inadequate. She was pursuing an aircraft that challenged fundamental assumptions about technology, piloted by someone who'd chosen her specifically for this encounter. As they passed through 45,000 feet, the sky around them transformed from blue to deep purple, stars becoming visible even in daylight. This was the edge of space, where only specialized aircraft could operate, where the boundary between atmosphere and vacuum became academic. And still Phantom Wing climbed, effortlessly, as if gravity was merely another suggestion to be politely ignored. Her radio crackled with increasingly urgent transmissions from control, but the words seemed distant now, part of a world she was leaving behind. Ahead of her, the impossible aircraft was opening doorways to possibilities she'd never imagined, and she'd made her choice. At 50,000 feet, the curvature of the Earth became clearly visible, a blue marble suspended against the blackness of space. Phantom Wing leveled off here, maintaining position while Valentina's Typhoon caught up, her engines working at maximum capacity just to maintain this altitude. The mysterious aircraft seemed perfectly comfortable in this rarefied environment, as if it had been designed specifically for operations at the edge of space. And then, as she watched in fascination, Phantom Wing began to transmit. Not radio signals, but something far more direct and immediate. Images appeared in her mind with crystalline clarity, not hallucinations, but shared memories transferred through technology she couldn't begin to understand. She saw a hidden facility carved into mountain rock, where aircraft like Phantom Wing were maintained and tested. She saw pilots from a dozen nations, men and women who'd been recruited from the ranks of the officially dead, given technology that transcended national boundaries in service of purposes beyond conventional military doctrine. She saw her own squadron mates from Ukraine, alive and flying aircraft that made Phantom Wing look primitive by comparison. The Ghost Squadron wasn't mythology, it was recruitment. "Welcome, Viper," a voice spoke directly into her mind, carrying accents she recognized from comrades thought lost forever. "We've been waiting for you." The voice belonged to someone she'd known, someone whose funeral she'd attended 2 years ago in a ceremony closed to all but family. Captain Alina Volkov, her former wingman, officially killed when her MiG-29 suffered catastrophic engine failure over the Black Sea. But the woman speaking in her mind was very much alive, and flying technology that represented humanity's first steps toward something far greater than national air superiority. "Elena," Valentina whispered, not trusting her voice to carry the weight of disbelief and hope warring in her chest. "You're supposed to be dead." "Death is just another form of recruitment." Elena's voice carried warmth that no amount of advanced technology could fabricate. "When conventional warfare reaches its limits, when the best pilots are wasted on missions designed by politicians who have never felt G-forces, alternative arrangements become necessary." Through the mental link, Valentina experienced Elena's memories from the past 2 years. The staged death, carefully orchestrated to remove a pilot whose skills exceeded the strategic vision of military leaders who saw aircraft as expensive chess pieces, rather than instruments of transcendence. The recruitment into a program that selected pilots based not on nationality or political allegiance, but on pure flying ability and the psychological flexibility to operate beyond conventional parameters. "The facility you're seeing operates outside national authority," Elena continued, sharing images of the mountain complex where conventional physics gave way to technologies that seemed closer to science fiction than military hardware. "We recruit pilots who have been lost to wars that waste talent, who have proven themselves capable of thinking beyond the limitations imposed by terrestrial concerns." Valentina felt her worldview reshaping itself around concepts that had seemed impossible minutes earlier. The Ghost Squadron wasn't a Ukrainian legend, but an international organization dedicated to advancing human aviation capabilities beyond anything Earth-bound air forces could imagine. They operated in the spaces between nations, in the gaps where exceptional pilots disappeared from official records, and re-emerged with access to technologies decades ahead of anything in conventional arsenals. "Why me?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Why now?" "Because you see what others miss. Because you've learned to fly when others would crash. Because the next phase of human aviation requires pilots who understand that the sky has no borders, only possibilities." Below them, the North Sea stretched like a wrinkled blue skin across the planet's surface. Above them, space beckoned with promises of flight environments where the only limitations were those imposed by imagination and engineering. And ahead of them, Phantom Wing maintained position with mechanical patience, waiting for her decision. Valentina thought of the squadron back at RAF Luchars, pilots who flew by textbook procedures, and considered her presence an unwelcome complication to their established routines. She thought of the military bureaucracy that measured success by adherence to doctrine rather than innovation, that punished creative thinking in favor of predictable mediocrity. Then she thought of Elena, officially dead but very much alive, flying aircraft that represented humanity's first tentative steps toward the stars. She thought of possibilities that transcended the petty conflicts that had consumed her homeland, of flight that acknowledged no boundaries except those imposed by physics itself. The choice wasn't difficult, it was inevitable. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her words carrying commitment that made her previous military service seem like mere preparation for this moment. Through the mental link, she felt Elena's smile, warm and familiar across technological gaps that shouldn't have been possible to bridge. "Follow me home, Viper. We have aircraft that need proper pilots and missions that require someone who understands that the sky belongs to those brave enough to claim it." Phantom Wing began to bank toward coordinates that didn't appear on any terrestrial chart, leading her toward a future where the word impossible would lose all meaning. Behind her, RAF Luchars was already becoming memory. Ahead of her, the real war for humanity's place in the sky was just beginning. The mountain facility appeared gradually, revealing itself like a mirage solidifying into reality. From 50,000 feet, it looked like a natural geological formation, peaks and valleys that belonged to Norwegian geography. But as they descended, following a flight path that wound through valleys too perfect to be natural, Valentina began to see evidence of human engineering on a scale that dwarfed anything she'd encountered in conventional military service. Runways carved directly into mountainsides, their surfaces composed of materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Hangar doors that opened like massive stone lips, revealing internal spaces that extended far deeper into the mountain than external dimensions should have allowed. And aircraft, dozens of them, each representing technological leaps that made her Typhoon seem like a museum piece, despite its cutting-edge status in the conventional world. Visual contact with base. Elena's voice guided her through approach procedures that felt more like ritual than navigation. "Maintain formation with my aircraft. Landing systems here operate differently than anything you've experienced." Differently was an understatement. As they approached the primary runway, Valentina realized she felt no reduction in altitude despite the clearly descending flight path. Her instruments registered level flight, while her eyes confirmed they were diving toward the mountain at angles that should have triggered every stall warning in her aircraft. Whatever technology governed this airspace had suspended normal relationships between motion and perception. Phantom Wing touched down first, its impossible construction settling onto the runway with grace that made landing look like an aesthetic choice, rather than a surrender to gravity. The aircraft taxied toward a hangar large enough to accommodate a squadron of heavy bombers, its doors opening with mechanical precision that spoke of systems maintained to standards beyond military specification. Valentina followed, her Typhoon feeling awkward and primitive as it rolled across surfaces that provided perfect grip despite appearing smoother than polished marble. The runway seemed to extend as she needed distance, shortening when rapid deceleration became necessary. Physics here served pilot convenience rather than imposing absolute limitations. As her aircraft came to a stop inside the hangar, she found herself surrounded by technology that challenged every assumption about aviation development. Fighters with wing configurations that changed shape during taxi operations. Vertical takeoff aircraft that showed no evidence of propulsion systems, yet moved with perfect control. And everywhere, the quiet efficiency of maintenance crews whose equipment belonged more to spacecraft servicing than conventional aircraft support. The hangar doors closed behind them with the finality of a chapter ending, sealing her inside a world where the impossible had become routine. Her Typhoon's engines wound down, their familiar whine replaced by the subtle harmonics of technologies that operated on principles she couldn't begin to understand. Elena's aircraft. She couldn't bring herself to think of it as Phantom Wing anymore. Now that she understood it represented an entire category of aviation advancement, settled into a maintenance bay where robotic systems began servicing procedures that looked more like artistic collaboration than mechanical maintenance. The aircraft seemed to respond to attention, its surfaces shifting color and configuration as automated systems attended to requirements beyond conventional fuel and ammunition replenishment. Through her canopy, Valentina could see figures approaching her aircraft. Not ground crew in the traditional sense, but people whose uniforms carried no national insignia, whose equipment suggested access to resources that transcended military budgets. And among them, walking with the confident stride of someone completely at home in this impossible environment, was Elena Volkov. Very much alive, very much smiling, very much eager to welcome her old wingman to a new kind of war. Valentina completed her shutdown procedures with mechanical precision, muscle memory taking over while her mind struggled to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. 2 hours ago, she'd been the unwanted foreign pilot in a routine intercept mission. Now she was the newest recruit in an organization that operated aircraft beyond anything in terrestrial inventories. As she cracked her canopy and felt mountain air carrying scents of technologies she couldn't identify, one thought dominated her consciousness. Everything she'd understood about the limits of human flight had been preparation for this moment, when limitations themselves became irrelevant. The debriefing room defied architectural logic, its walls seeming to extend farther than the mountain's external dimensions should have allowed. Elena sat across from her at a table that appeared to be carved from a single piece of some black stone that reflected light in patterns too complex for human eyes to fully process. Between them, holographic displays showed real-time feeds from air bases across Europe, where confused controllers were filing reports about phantom wing encounters that would be classified beyond public access. Your squadron leader is having a difficult conversation with his superiors, Elena observed, manipulating the hologram to show Ashworth in a briefing room at RAF Luchars, his face carrying the expression of a man whose career had just encountered something beyond conventional explanation. Official report will list equipment malfunctions and training exercise complications. Delta 7 will be listed as suffering communication failure and emergency landing at an undisclosed location. Valentina watched the feed with detached interest. That world, those concerns, already felt distant despite the few hours that had passed since her departure. What happens to my aircraft? My official status? Your Typhoon will be returned to RAF Luchars with appropriate modifications to its flight data recorder. As far as official records are concerned, you experienced engine problems and diverted to a Norwegian emergency field, where you're currently awaiting parts and weather clearance. Elena's smile carried hints of satisfaction that suggested this scenario had been implemented many times before. Your military service record will show an honorable medical discharge following psychological evaluation. Stress-related flight anxiety, very common among pilots who have seen extensive combat. Medical discharge. After everything she'd survived, everything she'd accomplished, her official military career would end with psychiatric unfitness for duty. The irony was almost amusing. And in reality, you're about to begin the most challenging pilot training program in human history. Elena stood, gesturing toward floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed aircraft unlike anything in conventional service. What you flew to get here represents baseline capability for our newest recruits. The aircraft you'll learn to operate make Phantom Wing look like a training simulator. Through the windows, Valentina could see pilots conducting operations that redefined her understanding of flight. Aircraft that moved through three-dimensional space, as if gravity was merely another atmospheric condition to be adjusted rather than overcome. Maneuvers that treated the boundary between atmosphere and space as a minor inconvenience rather than an absolute limitation. And speeds that suggested these pilots had access to propulsion technologies, decades ahead of anything in conventional military inventories. Who funds this? She asked, the practical questions asserting themselves despite the overwhelming scope of what she was witnessing. Who has resources for technology like this? The same people who funded the development of radar, jet engines, and guided missiles, Alina replied, her tone suggesting the answer should be obvious. Defense contractors, research institutions, government agencies that operate beyond the oversight of elected officials. The difference is that this program answers to international rather than national authorities. International authorities, a concept that implied cooperation between nations whose surface-level politics suggested perpetual hostility. The technology around her spoke of resource commitments that exceeded any single country's military budget, of research programs that required cooperation between scientists and engineers, whose governments might officially consider each other adversaries. The pilots here represent the finest aviators from air forces that lost them to official death or medical discharge. Alina continued, leading her toward elevator doors that opened without apparent activation. Russian test pilots who disappeared during flights over Siberia. American naval aviators lost during carrier operations in the Pacific. Israeli pilots who vanished during classified missions over contested airspace. We recruit excellence, regardless of the flag painted on the aircraft they flew before joining us. The elevator descended through levels that existed far below the mountain's apparent base, passing illuminated sections that revealed workshops where aircraft components were manufactured, using techniques that seemed to blend metallurgy with something approaching alchemy. Through reinforced windows, she glimpsed laboratories where materials science met technologies that challenged fundamental assumptions about matter itself. "How long has this been operating?" Valentina asked, watching technicians work with substances that changed color and density in response to their manipulation. Officially, since 1962, when the Cuban Missile Crisis convinced certain forward-thinking individuals that humanity's aviation technology needed to advance beyond national limitations. Alina's reflection in the elevator's polished walls carried the weight of institutional memory. Unofficially, the first prototypes flew in 1944, using technology recovered from German research programs that were ahead of their time by decades. German research programs. Valentina had heard rumors during her service in Ukraine, stories passed between pilots about experimental aircraft that had appeared in the final months of World War II, flying at speeds and altitudes that conventional fighters couldn't match. Official histories dismissed these reports as wartime mythology, stress-induced hallucinations from pilots pushed beyond their psychological limits. The elevator stopped at a level designated by symbols rather than numbers, opening onto a corridor lined with photographs that documented the evolution of human flight from Wright brothers biplanes to aircraft that seemed to defy classification entirely. Each image carried dates and technical specifications that suggested aviation development had proceeded along two parallel tracks, one public and incremental, the other private and revolutionary. "Your training begins tomorrow," Alina said, leading her past photographs of aircraft she recognized from intelligence briefings as Soviet prototypes lost during testing, American experimental fighters that had officially crashed without recovery, and European designs that had never progressed beyond concept stage. 6 months of intensive instruction in physics, aerodynamics, and propulsion technologies that aren't taught in any conventional engineering program. 6 months. After years of flying aircraft whose capabilities she understood completely, the prospect of learning to operate technology beyond her current comprehension felt simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. The photographs around her suggested that human flight had evolved far beyond anything acknowledged in official aviation histories. "And after training?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would reshape her understanding of military aviation's ultimate purpose. "After training, you'll fly missions that transcend the territorial disputes that waste conventional pilots on objectives that serve political rather than strategic purposes." Alina stopped before a photograph showing an aircraft in flight above Earth's curvature, its design suggesting capabilities that belonged more to spacecraft than atmospheric fighters. We operate in the spaces between nations, in situations where conventional air forces would create diplomatic incidents that could escalate into conflicts nobody wants. The photograph carried a date from 6 months ago, and coordinates that placed it above airspace claimed by 3 different nations simultaneously. The aircraft itself showed no national markings, its configuration suggesting it could operate equally effectively in atmosphere or vacuum. And the pilot, visible through a canopy designed for visibility ranges beyond anything required for terrestrial flight, wore a helmet that carried no flag or unit insignia. Valentina studied the image, recognizing in the pilot's posture the confidence that came from operating technology that rendered conventional air defenses irrelevant. This was what she'd been recruited for, not to serve a particular nation's strategic interests, but to advance human aviation capabilities beyond the limitations imposed by terrestrial politics. "When do we begin?" she asked, the question carrying commitment that surprised her with its immediacy. Alina's smile carried satisfaction that suggested the answer had never been in doubt. "We begin now. Your first aircraft is waiting in Hangar 7. Her first aircraft. Not a type she'd transitioned to after completing ground school, but a specific machine assigned to her personally, configured for her flying style and modified to accommodate her particular approach to aerial operations. In conventional military service, pilots adapted to standardized aircraft. Here, aircraft were apparently adapted to individual pilots. As they walked toward Hangar 7, passing workshops where impossible technologies were treated as routine engineering challenges, Valentina felt the last connections to her previous military service dissolving. She was no longer Squadron Leader Kozlova of the Ukrainian Air Force, transferred to RAF service, and barely tolerated by colleagues who questioned her competence. She was Viper, recruited by an organization that valued flying ability above nationality, gender, or political allegiance. The hangar doors opened to reveal an aircraft that made her catch her breath involuntarily, not because of its size or obvious power, but because of its beauty. Every line spoke of speeds that belonged more to poetry than physics, of capabilities that transcended conventional limitations through engineering that approached art. The machine waiting for her represented humanity's first tentative steps beyond the boundaries that had confined aviation since its inception. "This is yours," Alina said simply. "Learn to fly it properly, and you'll understand why we recruited you." The aircraft designated as hers defied every convention she'd learned about fighter design. Where conventional fighters showed hard angles optimized for specific flight regimes, this machine flowed like liquid metal frozen at the moment of perfect aerodynamic expression. Its wingspan appeared to vary depending on viewing angle, sometimes broad and delta-shaped for low-speed maneuvering, other times narrow and swept for high-velocity operations. The fuselage merged seamlessly with wing surfaces, creating a unified form that suggested the entire aircraft functioned as a single airfoil capable of generating lift through principles beyond conventional understanding. No visible engine intakes marred its smooth surfaces, yet she could sense tremendous power contained within its structure. No weapons pylons broke its clean lines, though she suspected it carried defensive capabilities far beyond anything requiring external mounting points. And no national markings identified its origin, only a small symbol near the cockpit that she recognized from Alina's aircraft, the ghost wing emblem that identified pilots who'd officially died in service of their homelands. "Designation?" she asked, walking around the aircraft to appreciate its construction from multiple angles. "We don't use conventional designation systems," Alina replied, following her inspection tour. "Each aircraft is unique, configured specifically for its assigned pilot. Yours incorporates Ukrainian design philosophy merged with propulsion technologies that were theoretical until last year." Ukrainian design philosophy. Despite everything she'd experienced, the reference to her homeland's aviation heritage sent unexpected warmth through her chest. The aircraft before her somehow embodied principles she recognized from the MiG-29 she'd flown in combat: aggressive maneuverability, pilot-centric design, the assumption that superior pilot skills could overcome technological disadvantages. But those familiar concepts had been amplified by engineering capabilities that transcended anything her country's aircraft designers could have imagined. She completed her walk-around inspection, noting details that challenged every assumption about aircraft construction. The skin seemed to be composed of materials that shifted between metallic and organic appearance, responding to her proximity with subtle color changes that suggested some form of recognition system. Control surfaces appeared and disappeared as needed, the aircraft reshaping itself to optimize configuration for current requirements. "How does it fly?" she asked, though the question felt inadequate for describing interaction with technology this advanced. "It doesn't fly," Alina corrected, her tone carrying the patience of someone who'd struggled with the same conceptual limitations. "It dances. Physics becomes a partnership rather than a constraint. Gravity, air density, atmospheric pressure, they become variables you negotiate with rather than limitations you work within." Dancing with physics. The concept aligned with everything she'd loved about flying, taken to logical extremes she'd never imagined possible. Her best moments in combat had come when conventional tactics gave way to improvisation, when she'd found solutions that existed in the spaces between established procedures. This aircraft appeared designed specifically for pilots who thrived in those undefined territories. "Climb aboard," Alina suggested, gesturing toward a cockpit that opened like flower petals rather than hinged canopy. "The aircraft needs to calibrate itself to your neural patterns before first flight." Neural patterns. Valentina had heard references to pilot-machine interface technologies in theoretical discussions, but seeing the concept implemented in operational aircraft carried implications that made her pulse quicken. As she approached the cockpit, the aircraft responded to her presence with subtle harmonics that felt almost like recognition, as if it was evaluating her suitability as thoroughly as she was assessing its capabilities. The cockpit interior bore no resemblance to any fighter she'd flown. No traditional instrument panel crowded her forward vision. No switches and controls demanded memorization of complex procedures. Instead, surfaces that seemed to exist in dimensions slightly offset from conventional reality displayed information directly in her field of view, responding to her attention by highlighting relevant data and dimming unnecessary details. As she settled into the pilot's seat, she felt the aircraft beginning its calibration process. Not mechanical adjustment, but something far more intimate, the machine learning to anticipate her intentions, to respond to thoughts as quickly as hand movements. The interface between pilot and aircraft was becoming seamless, eliminating the delays inherent in conventional control systems. "Close your eyes," Alina instructed from somewhere that seemed simultaneously beside the cockpit and transmitted directly into her consciousness. "Let the aircraft learn your flying style. Show it how you think about three-dimensional movement." Valentina closed her eyes and found herself experiencing flight without motion, soaring through airspace that existed only in her mind, but felt absolutely real. The aircraft was reading her neural patterns, learning to interpret her instinctive responses to tactical situations, mapping the mental processes that had kept her alive through 57 combat missions in inferior equipment. When she opened her eyes, everything had changed. The cockpit now felt like an extension of her nervous system, every surface responding to her slightest intention. The aircraft wasn't just ready to fly, it was eager to demonstrate capabilities that would redefine her understanding of what human beings could accomplish in the sky. The first flight lasted 4 hours but felt like minutes, an experience so intense that conventional concepts of time became irrelevant. Lifting off from the mountain runway, Valentina discovered that her new aircraft didn't so much fly as inhabit three-dimensional space with perfect freedom. Gravity remained a constant, but it became negotiable rather than absolute, something to work with rather than struggle against. At 5,000 feet, she tested basic maneuvers and found that conventional limitations simply didn't apply. The aircraft could transition from level flight to vertical climb without the gradual acceleration conventional fighters required, could reverse direction without the wide turning radii imposed by aerodynamic constraints. It responded to her intentions as quickly as her thoughts formed, creating a unity between pilot and machine that transcended anything she'd experienced in traditional aircraft. Alina flew alongside in her own aircraft, serving as instructor and guide through flight regimes that challenged fundamental assumptions about atmospheric operations. Together, they climbed to altitudes where conventional engines would flame out, where control surfaces would lose effectiveness in thin air. But these aircraft seemed to thrive in conditions that would cripple traditional fighters, their performance improving as they left the dense atmosphere behind. Try the sprint mode. Alina's voice reached her through communication systems that operated without radio frequencies, transmitting directly from mind to mind with clarity that made conventional radio seem primitive by comparison. Think about where you want to be rather than how to get there. Thinking about destination rather than route represented a fundamental shift in flying philosophy. Valentina focused on a point 30 miles distant, visualizing arrival rather than travel, and felt the aircraft respond to her intent with acceleration that transcended anything possible through conventional propulsion. The landscape below blurred past at speeds that should have been uncomfortable, but the aircraft's inertial management systems eliminated the physiological stress that normally accompanied rapid velocity changes. They covered 30 miles in less than 2 minutes, arriving at coordinates she'd selected with precision that suggested navigation by intention rather than instrument guidance. The aircraft had somehow translated her mental destination into flight path, managing energy and trajectory without requiring conscious pilot input for the technical aspects of high-speed flight. Now try combat maneuvering, Alina instructed, positioning her aircraft in what would conventionally be considered an attacking position. Defend yourself using instinct rather than procedure. Combat maneuvering in aircraft that operated beyond conventional physics created scenarios, unlike anything covered in tactical manuals. When Alina initiated what appeared to be a missile attack, Valentina responded by thinking about evasion rather than executing specific defensive maneuvers. Her aircraft interpreted her survival instincts, implementing defensive actions that included maneuvers impossible in traditional fighters. She found herself diving vertically while simultaneously executing a barrel roll, pulling G-forces that should have exceeded human tolerance, but felt manageable thanks to the aircraft's physiological support systems. The machine anticipated her defensive requirements, suggesting evasive options through direct neural interface rather than forcing her to consciously evaluate tactical alternatives. For 2 hours, they engaged in air-to-air combat exercises that redefined her understanding of aerial warfare. Conventional concepts like energy management and situational awareness remained relevant, but they were enhanced by capabilities that allowed implementation of tactics previously limited to theoretical discussion. When Alina simulated surface-to-air missile attacks, Valentina discovered her aircraft could operate effectively in space-like conditions, using the upper atmosphere as a refuge from threats that couldn't follow above 50,000 feet. The training flight concluded with formation flying that demonstrated the aircraft's ability to operate as part of integrated units. Alina led her through maneuvers that required precise coordination between machines operating at speeds and altitudes where conventional fighters would lose cohesion. They flew as a single entity despite being separated by distances that would make radio communication difficult, their aircraft coordinating through the same neural interface systems that connected pilot to machine. As they returned to the mountain facility, Valentina realized that her understanding of military aviation had been fundamentally altered by 4 hours of flight time. The aircraft she'd been assigned didn't just exceed the performance parameters of conventional fighters. It operated in flight regimes where conventional fighters couldn't function at all. Landing back at the hidden facility, she felt the profound satisfaction that came from flying technology that matched rather than constrained her capabilities as a pilot. For the first time since leaving Ukraine, she was operating equipment worthy of the skills combat had taught her. Evaluation complete, Alina announced as they taxied toward the hangar where maintenance crews waited with equipment she was beginning to recognize as standard for aircraft that operated beyond conventional parameters. You're ready for advanced training. Advanced training. If what she just experienced was basic orientation, the prospect of advanced instruction carried implications that made her pulse quicken with anticipation rather than concern. The advanced training facility occupied levels of the mountain complex that existed in dimensions slightly offset from conventional reality, spaces where the normal relationship between interior and exterior volume had been suspended through technologies that challenged architectural possibility. Valentina followed Elena through corridors that seemed to extend far beyond the mountain's external dimensions, past laboratories where the boundary between materials science and applied physics dissolved into research that approached the theoretical limits of human understanding. Flight training represents only 30% of pilot development here, Alina explained as they walked past workshops where aircraft components were manufactured using techniques that seemed to blend engineering with something approaching alchemy. The remaining 70% involves understanding why these aircraft work, rather than simply learning to operate them. Understanding the principles behind impossible technology meant education in physics concepts that weren't taught in any conventional university. As they entered the primary instruction facility, Valentina found herself facing curriculum that included theoretical frameworks she'd never encountered, mathematical relationships that described reality in terms that transcended textbook explanations of aerodynamics and propulsion. The instructor waiting for them carried credentials that would have impressed theoretical physicists at the world's premier research institutions, but his introduction focused on practical applications rather than academic achievement. Dr. Marcus Webb had spent 20 years translating breakthrough discoveries in quantum mechanics and exotic matter research into technologies that allowed human beings to operate aircraft beyond conventional limitations. Traditional aviation operates within constraints imposed by atmospheric density, gravitational fields, and the chemical energy limits of conventional propulsion, he began, gesturing toward holographic displays that showed conventional aircraft struggling with barriers that seemed absolute and unchangeable. Our aircraft operate by negotiating with those constraints rather than accepting them as limitations. Negotiating with physics represented a conceptual framework that required abandoning assumptions about natural laws being unchangeable. The holographic displays showed aircraft operating in ways that seemed to violate fundamental principles, but Webb's explanation revealed that they were actually exploiting aspects of reality that conventional technology couldn't access. Matter and energy exist in states that standard physics describes as theoretical, he continued, manipulating the displays to show atomic-level interactions that occurred within the aircraft's propulsion systems. Your aircraft generates thrust by converting matter into exotic energy states that interact with spacetime in ways that conventional engines can't achieve. Exotic energy states. Valentina had encountered references to such concepts in theoretical papers published by research institutions whose work remained classified beyond public access, but seeing the principles implemented in operational aircraft carried implications that challenged everything she'd understood about technological possibility. The training progressed through concepts that required mental flexibility, beyond anything demanded by conventional pilot education. She learned to think about flight in terms of energy state management rather than aerodynamic force generation, to understand her aircraft's capabilities in terms of quantum mechanical interactions rather than mechanical systems producing thrust through traditional means. Your aircraft doesn't overcome gravity, Webb explained during a session that focused on high-altitude operations. It negotiates local gravitational fields by manipulating the quantum vacuum that underlies apparent empty space. This allows operations in flight regimes where conventional aircraft would cease to function. Manipulating quantum vacuum meant her aircraft could operate effectively in conditions where conventional physics suggested flight was impossible. The theoretical framework explained observations from her first training flight, how the machine could accelerate without apparent propellant consumption, how it maintained control authority at altitudes where conventional control surfaces would lose effectiveness. 3 weeks into advanced training, she began to understand that the technology represented humanity's first practical implementation of discoveries that challenged the boundaries between science and engineering possibility. The aircraft she'd been assigned incorporated research that advanced human understanding of reality itself, knowledge that had been developed specifically to enable operations beyond atmospheric limitations. Tomorrow we begin space operations training, Alina announced at the conclusion of a session that had covered propulsion technologies based on principles that weren't acknowledged in conventional physics textbooks. Your aircraft is designed for operations in vacuum as well as atmosphere. Space operations. The concept represented the logical extension of everything she'd been learning, but the practical implications made her pause with anticipation that bordered on disbelief. She was being trained to operate aircraft in environments where conventional fighters couldn't function, in flight regimes that belonged more to spacecraft than atmospheric aviation. That night, lying in quarters that existed within the mountain complex's impossible geometry, she contemplated the trajectory that had brought her from routine intercept missions to training for operations beyond Earth's atmosphere. 6 months ago, she'd been flying obsolete aircraft in a war that wasted pilot talent on objectives that served political rather than strategic purposes. Now she was learning to operate technology that represented humanity's first tentative steps toward true spacefaring capability, aircraft that could transition seamlessly between atmospheric and vacuum operations. The transformation felt simultaneously natural and impossible, as if her entire military career had been preparation for opportunities she'd never imagined possible. Space operations training began with theoretical instruction that challenged every assumption about the relationship between aircraft and operating environment. In the facility's zero-gravity simulator, Valentina learned that her aircraft's capabilities extended far beyond atmospheric flight, that the machine was equally at home in vacuum conditions where conventional fighters would be helpless chunks of metal. Atmospheric flight represents baseline capability, Dr. Webb explained as she practiced maneuvering in simulated vacuum conditions. Your aircraft is designed for operations in environments where gravity, air density, and atmospheric pressure become academic rather than practical concerns. The simulator created conditions identical to space operations, allowing her to experience three-dimensional movement without reference to concepts like up or down that dominated atmospheric flight. Her aircraft responded to intentions rather than control inputs, translating her tactical requirements into maneuvers that exploited the unique possibilities of vacuum operations. Without atmospheric interference, speeds became limited only by energy availability rather than air resistance. Without gravity wells to constrain maneuvering, tactical options expanded to include possibilities that had no equivalent in atmospheric combat. And without the sensory references that guided conventional flight, navigation became an exercise in pure spatial reasoning that challenged her understanding of movement itself. In vacuum, your aircraft operates more like a spacecraft than a traditional fighter, Alina observed during joint training exercises that simulated combat scenarios beyond Earth's atmosphere. Energy management becomes paramount, but the energy available exceeds anything possible through conventional propulsion. Energy management in space meant understanding her aircraft's ability to convert matter into exotic propulsion states that provided thrust without traditional reaction mass limitations. The machine could accelerate continuously without consuming fuel in conventional sense, drawing power from quantum interactions that conventional physics described as theoretical. 3 weeks of space operations training culminated in actual vacuum flight, launched from the mountain facility using launch systems that bore no resemblance to conventional rockets. Her aircraft simply transitioned from atmospheric to space operations without the complex staging procedures required by traditional spacecraft, climbing through progressively thinner atmosphere until stars became visible even during daylight hours. At 100 miles altitude, officially in space by any conventional definition, her aircraft performed with the same responsiveness it showed in atmospheric flight. Control authority remained perfect. Acceleration characteristics actually improved in the absence of air resistance, and the machine's life support systems maintained cockpit conditions that made vacuum operations feel routine rather than extraordinary. "Welcome to your new operational environment," Alina transmitted through communication systems that operated effectively across interplanetary distances. "This is where your real training begins." Real training. Everything she'd experienced during the past 2 months had been preparation for operations in flight regimes where conventional military aviation ceased to be relevant. As Earth curved away beneath them, showing the familiar blue marble that had inspired poets and philosophers throughout human history, Valentina realized that her recruitment represented humanity's first steps toward military operations beyond atmospheric limitations. The aircraft she'd been assigned was more than advanced technology. It was a glimpse of humanity's future among the stars, piloted by individuals whose flying skills exceeded the constraints imposed by terrestrial conflicts. They were no longer earthbound pilots operating within atmospheric limitations, but pioneers exploring flight possibilities that belonged to species capable of claiming the solar system itself. 6 months of training concluded with mission qualifications that would have seemed impossible when she'd first encountered Phantom Wing above the North Sea. Valentina now operated aircraft that could transition seamlessly between atmospheric and space flight, that could outperform any conventional fighter in Earth skis, while remaining equally capable of operations in vacuum conditions that would destroy traditional aircraft. Her final evaluation took place during a mission that demonstrated the full scope of capabilities her training had developed. Intelligence reports indicated that conventional air forces were tracking unusual aircraft signatures over the Pacific, requiring intervention by pilots whose aircraft could investigate without creating diplomatic incidents that might escalate into international conflicts. Mission parameters. Alina briefed her as they prepared aircraft for deployment to coordinates 800 miles above Earth's surface. Investigate unknown contacts, determine threat assessment, and implement appropriate responses using minimum force necessary to resolve situation without conventional military involvement. Minimum force meant utilizing aircraft capabilities that rendered conventional air defense systems irrelevant, demonstrating superiority through technological advantage rather than aggressive action. Their aircraft could operate in flight regimes where conventional fighters couldn't follow, could project presence without threatening actions that might provoke military responses from nations whose pilots couldn't understand what they were encountering. The mission launched from coordinates that placed them above Pacific airspace in less than 30 minutes, their aircraft covering distances that would require hours for conventional fighters operating within atmospheric limitations. At altitude where conventional aircraft couldn't function, they maintained observation positions that allowed complete surveillance of air traffic across thousands of square miles of ocean. The unknown contacts proved to be prototype aircraft from a nation attempting to develop technology beyond conventional limitations, experimental fighters that represented impressive engineering achievements but remained constrained by atmospheric flight requirements. The pilots operating them were skilled professionals doing their best with equipment that approached, but didn't achieve the capabilities necessary for operations beyond conventional parameters. Assessment complete, Valentina transmitted to Alina after observing the prototypes conduct flight tests that pushed conventional technology toward its absolute limits. No threat to operational security. Recommend passive observation until mission completion. Passive observation meant allowing the experimental aircraft to complete their testing without interference, demonstrating through presence alone that their technological achievements, while impressive, remained several generations behind capabilities available to pilots who operated beyond national limitations. The message would be received and understood by intelligence services that monitored such activities. 2 hours of observation confirmed that conventional military aviation was progressing predictably toward capabilities that remained decades behind what she now flew routinely. The gap between her aircraft and the most advanced conventional fighters had become so significant that comparison was barely meaningful. She was operating technology that belonged to humanity's spacefaring future, while conventional air forces remained constrained by atmospheric limitations. The mission concluded with return to base using flight profiles that took them beyond lunar orbit before diving back through Earth's atmosphere, demonstrating operational ranges that made terrestrial geography irrelevant to mission planning. Her aircraft could deploy to any location in the solar system, conduct operations for extended periods, and return to base without requiring the complex logistics chains that constrained conventional military operations. Mission complete, she reported as they landed back at the mountain facility that had become her new operational base. Targets assessed, threat level minimal, no engagement required. No engagement required. The most advanced conventional aircraft represented no meaningful challenge to pilots whose training had prepared them for operations beyond atmospheric constraints. The technology gap had become so significant that demonstration of presence alone was sufficient to establish air superiority over any conventional forces. As they taxied toward hangars where maintenance crews waited with equipment designed for aircraft that operated beyond conventional parameters, Valentina reflected on the transformation her career had undergone since that morning 6 months ago, when she'd been flying routine intercept missions in equipment that now seemed primitive by comparison. She was no longer Squadron Leader Kozlova of the Ukrainian Air Force, transferred to RAF service and barely tolerated by colleagues who questioned her competence. She was Viper, qualified to operate humanity's most advanced aircraft in flight regimes where conventional pilots couldn't function, trained for missions that transcended the territorial disputes that wasted conventional military aviation on objectives serving political rather than strategic purposes. The real war for humanity's place in the sky had begun, and she was ready to fight it. The first operational mission came without warning, transmitted through communication systems that operated beyond conventional radio frequencies, and delivered information directly to pilots qualified for deployment beyond Earth's atmosphere. Valentina received the briefing while conducting routine maintenance on her aircraft, the details appearing in her consciousness with clarity that made written orders seem primitive by comparison. Unknown contact detected in lunar orbit, exhibiting flight characteristics beyond conventional technology parameters. Object appears to be conducting surveillance of Earth communication satellites, possibly preparing to interfere with global communication networks. Immediate investigation required by pilots qualified for extended-range operations. Extended-range operations meant deployment to distances where Earth became a distant blue star, operations in space environments where conventional military aviation had never functioned. The mission parameters required capabilities that only a handful of pilots possessed, aircraft that could travel interplanetary distances while maintaining full combat readiness. "Time to deployment," she asked Alina, who'd received identical briefing information through the same neural communication systems that connected all pilots qualified for operations beyond atmospheric limitations. "Immediate," Alina replied, her tone carrying the focused intensity that accompanied missions where normal safety protocols gave way to operational necessities. "Target is approaching Earth's Lagrange points, position optimal for interference with satellite communications. Mission priority supersedes routine deployment procedures." Mission priority meant launching directly from their current position rather than following standard preparation protocols, deploying to lunar orbit using flight profiles that would take them beyond conventional radar coverage in less than 2 hours. Their aircraft were ready for immediate operation, maintained in constant readiness for deployment to anywhere in the solar system. They launched vertically from the mountain facility, their aircraft transitioning seamlessly from atmospheric to vacuum flight, without the complex staging procedures conventional spacecraft required. Within minutes, Earth's curvature was clearly visible below them, the familiar blue marble that had seemed so vast during atmospheric operations now revealed as a small planet suspended in infinite darkness. "Contact acquired," Valentina reported as her aircraft's sensors detected the unknown object at distances where conventional radar would show empty space. "Bearing 270 relative to lunar position, range approximately 50,000 kilometers, moving in pattern consistent with surveillance operations." 50,000 kilometers. Distance that placed them in operational environment where Earth's gravity became academic rather than practical concern, where their aircraft operated with freedom that belonged more to spacecraft than traditional fighters. The target was maintaining position that allowed observation of Earth's satellite constellation, while remaining beyond range of conventional detection systems. As they approached the unknown contact, Valentina began to understand why immediate investigation had been necessary. The object wasn't a conventional spacecraft or satellite, but something that challenged fundamental assumptions about technological development. Its configuration suggested engineering principles beyond anything in human inventories, capabilities that implied origins beyond terrestrial development programs. "Visual contact confirmed," Alina transmitted as the target resolved into details that made both pilots pause involuntarily. "Object appears to be non-terrestrial in origin." Non-terrestrial. The implications carried weight that transformed routine investigation mission into first contact scenario, operations for which no training manual could provide adequate preparation. The object maintaining surveillance position above Earth was clearly artificial, obviously technological, but its design suggested engineering principles that human science hadn't achieved. The spacecraft, there was no other appropriate designation, measured approximately 200 meters in length, constructed from materials that seemed to shift between solid and translucent appearance depending on viewing angle. No visible propulsion systems marred its smooth surfaces, yet it maintained perfect position relative to Earth's satellite constellation, despite gravitational influences that should have caused orbital decay. "Mission parameters change," Alina announced, her voice carrying the weight of decisions that would influence humanity's future relationship with technologies beyond terrestrial development. "We are now conducting first contact protocols with unknown intelligence." First contact protocols. Neither of them had received training for scenarios involving non-terrestrial technology, but their aircraft were apparently equipped for such encounters. As they approached within 10 kilometers of the alien spacecraft, Valentina felt her aircraft's systems activating communication protocols she hadn't known existed, attempting to establish contact using methods that transcended conventional radio transmission. The response came immediately, not as sound or visual signals, but as direct information transfer that bypassed sensory input entirely. The alien spacecraft was transmitting detailed specifications of its mission parameters, technological capabilities, and origin coordinates that placed it from star systems whose names appeared in no human catalog. The intelligence controlling the spacecraft had been observing Earth for purposes that transcended simple surveillance. It was evaluating humanity's technological development, specifically monitoring advancement in aviation and space technologies that might indicate readiness for contact with civilizations whose capabilities exceeded terrestrial achievements by orders of magnitude. They've been waiting for us, Valentina realized, understanding flooding through her as the alien intelligence shared information about observation protocols that had monitored human flight development since the first successful heavier-than-air aircraft had left the ground. Waiting for humans to develop technology capable of meaningful contact. Waiting for technological parity sufficient to enable communication between species whose development had followed different evolutionary paths toward the same ultimate objective, mastery of flight, that transcended planetary limitations. The spacecraft maintaining position above Earth represented a civilization that had achieved spacefaring capability thousands of years before humans had invented powered flight. But they had waited, observing patiently while humanity struggled through the early stages of technological development, maintaining surveillance until human pilots achieved capabilities that enabled meaningful interaction. The aircraft she and Alina flew represented humanity's first tentative steps toward technology that alien civilizations considered baseline requirement for inclusion in interstellar community. Contact established, Alina transmitted to their base, her words carrying implications that would reshape humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Target confirmed as non-terrestrial intelligence conducting peaceful observation. Recommend immediate consultation with highest authority levels. Highest authority levels. The mission had transcended military aviation operations, becoming humanity's first confirmed contact with intelligence beyond Earth. The protocols governing such scenarios existed in theoretical frameworks that nobody had expected to implement during operational missions. The alien spacecraft began transmitting technical specifications that revealed the true purpose of their surveillance mission. They had been evaluating human pilot capabilities, specifically monitoring the development of aircraft that could operate beyond atmospheric limitations. The technology Valentina flew had apparently satisfied criteria that qualified humanity for inclusion in what the aliens called the spacefaring community. As she absorbed information about interstellar civilizations whose aviation capabilities made her aircraft seem primitive by comparison, Valentina realized that her recruitment 6 months ago had been part of a larger pattern. The Ghost Squadron didn't just represent humanity's most advanced aviation technology. It was humanity's application for membership in a community that spanned star systems and included species whose mastery of flight exceeded anything she'd imagined possible. The real war for humanity's place in the sky wasn't being fought between terrestrial nations. It was humanity's struggle to develop capabilities sufficient for survival in a universe where flight was the fundamental skill that determined species' survival among the stars. The debriefing took place in facilities that existed beyond the mountain complex's conventional dimensions, spaces designed specifically for processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions about humanity's place in the universe. Valentina sat across from Alina, and a collection of officials whose credentials transcended any single nation's authority, their uniforms carrying insignia that represented international cooperation beyond anything acknowledged in public diplomatic channels. Confirmation of non-terrestrial intelligence changes operational parameters for all pilots qualified for extended-range missions, announced General Morrison, whose British accent carried authority that spoke of coordination between military services that officially had no knowledge of each other's advanced programs. Your mission has established that humanity's aviation development is being monitored by civilizations whose technological capabilities exceed our current achievements. Current achievements. The phrase carried implications that suggested human aviation technology was progressing along trajectories that alien civilizations considered predictable development patterns they'd observed in other species that eventually achieved spacefaring capability. Humanity was apparently following a template that had been refined through contact with dozens of civilizations across the galaxy. The spacecraft you encountered represents a monitoring station, Dr. Webb explained, manipulating holographic displays that showed technical specifications transmitted by the alien intelligence during their brief contact. They've been observing human flight development since 1903, waiting for us to achieve capabilities that indicate readiness for inclusion in interstellar community. Since 1903, the alien surveillance had begun when the Wright brothers first achieved powered flight, monitoring human progress through every stage of aviation development from fabric-covered biplanes to spacecraft capable of interplanetary operations. They had waited patiently, while humanity struggled through world wars that wasted aviation technology on territorial disputes, rather than advancing toward genuine spacefaring capability. Their evaluation criteria focused specifically on pilot capabilities, General Morrison continued, his tone carrying weight that suggested the information came from multiple contact sessions beyond the one she'd participated in. Technology can be shared between civilizations, but pilot skills must be developed independently. Species that develop superior pilots earn inclusion in spacefaring community. Those that don't remain confined to single-planet operations. Pilot skills as the determining factor for species advancement represented a concept that challenged conventional assumptions about technological development. The aliens apparently evaluated civilizations based on their ability to produce individuals capable of operating advanced aircraft rather than their ability to engineer such aircraft independently. Your aircraft, Alina added, gesturing toward displays that showed technical specifications beyond anything she'd understood during her training, incorporate technology shared by alien civilizations with humanity's most advanced pilots. The Ghost Squadron operates aircraft that represent collaborative engineering between human and non-terrestrial intelligence. Collaborative engineering. The technology she'd been flying for 6 months wasn't purely human achievement, but represented the first fruits of cooperation between humanity and civilizations that had mastered interstellar flight thousands of years earlier. Her training had been preparation not just for advanced human aviation, but for operations using technology that transcended terrestrial development entirely. Mission assignments change effective immediately, General Morrison announced, his words carrying authority that transcended military rank structure. All pilots qualified for extended-range operations are hereby assigned to interstellar liaison duties. Your primary mission is establishing humanity's credentials as a spacefaring species. Interstellar liaison duties. The concept represented responsibilities beyond anything covered in conventional military training, operations that would determine humanity's future relationship with civilizations whose capabilities exceeded Earth's technological achievements by orders of magnitude. They were no longer military pilots serving national interests, but humanity's representatives to a galactic community that measured species' worth by aviation capabilities. Training protocols expand to include xenotechnology familiarization and interspecies communication procedures, Dr. Webb added, his tone suggesting that the advanced instruction she'd completed was merely preparation for education in technologies that operated beyond human scientific understanding. Your aircraft will be upgraded with systems that enable communication and coordination with non-terrestrial intelligence. Upgraded systems meant integration of alien technology that would enhance her aircraft's capabilities beyond anything she'd experienced during training. The machine she'd learned too.